Hello. It is 10:02 PST on Saturday, September 29th. Can you guys hear me? Can you hear me? I am here with my friend Annie, and we are going to talk about the Enneagram in just a minute. Can you hear me okay? Annie will be here in a sec. She's just making sure that we looking glamorous in our pajamas this Saturday morning. Yay, glad you can hear. Hi. I'm so excited to talk about this. I'm so glad you guys are here. You guys having a good morning. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit with Annie, and then she's going to do a little bit of a typing interview with me, which is something that she does in her practice. So if you're someone who's like, what is the Enneagram? How do I use it? She does typing interviews where she will talk to someone, ask them a series of questions, and hear about their life and who they are and how they see the world. And then through that, she's able to support them in figuring out what type they are. Shout out to everyone in their pajamas. I know I'm in mine. Super comfy, loving life. And hi, Mom. Hi. So what we'll do is talk for a while, and then so it doesn't get so long, because I don't want this to be like an hour for you guys, we'll have some of my interview live, and then the rest of it, I will just, click out of this, and then I'll come back and post my sort of reaction of what the interview was like for me, what I learned about myself, stuff like that. So Annie is here. Guys, give Annie a wave. So this is my dear friend Annie, and we met because of the Enneagram work.
Yes, we did.
Yeah, so one of my very besties, Liz Bohannon, that lives in Portland, was like, oh, I'm doing an Enneagram retreat. And I was like, I'm so jealous. I want to do an Enneagram retreat. And then she introed me to Annie, and now we've done 2 Enneagram workshops at Light Lab, which have been amazing. And now you're here to talk to me a little bit more. So, okay, so I'm going to turn towards you a little bit, and I'll try to, make sure that you're in that. Can you tell me and anyone listening, just like if they're like, what is the Enneagram? Or I've heard a lot about the Enneagram, and I'm tired of hearing about it because it doesn't make any sense. And I'm tired of people being like, I took an online test, and can you just give like brief intro? What is it?
Yes. So the Enneagram is, it means, Ennea is Greek for 9, and gramos means sort of symbol. So it's a 9-sided symbol. Actually, I have a photo.
Oh, hey.
Yes. And each of these points around here represent 9 different types. Originally, in the early days, before it met modern psychology, it was all about spiritual archetypes. And then in the 70s, it made its way up to Berkeley, good old Berkeley, California, where it merged with modern psychology. Thanks to Ichazo and Naranjo. And then it started to take on this life of its own. And essentially, the 9 types represent 9 different ways of being motivated in the world. And when we combine it with personality psychology, we have 9 different sets of feelings and thinking patterns or fixations and activities that people often do in the world. But they're all centered around this often unconscious motivation that people live out of. The cool thing about the Enneagram, I think, is that it's really dynamic because it talks about motivation, and that's the primary focus. It's not the activities or the behavioral elements that you're really identifying with when you begin to identify with one of these types. And that's important because also when we use this map, we're using it for freedom. So this is why a lot of people get frustrated when they start to learn about the Enneagram from other people, because what it does, it's like really precise, and actually when people identify with a type, they're often like, oh my gosh, what? Like, I didn't even know this about myself. I didn't realize how much these kinds of motivations were running the show without me knowing. And then when people find out about it, they get really excited, which is cool because it can be such an incredible tool. But then they get so excited that they go around and they want everyone else to be excited about it. And they
Hearts if you know what she's talking about. Hearts if you know what she's talking about. How many people have been like, oh my gosh, you're such a 2. Oh my gosh, you're such a 7. And you're just like, shut the...
Yeah. And I mean, this makes sense, right? Like when you discover something like this for yourself, first of all, it can be really overwhelming in a hard way. A lot of people I have worked with people who have been like, for the first 2 years of knowing my type, I was just sort of devastated. Like I avoided it because it felt so painful. They were so aware of the hold that the fears of their type had on them. And so then if you can imagine that if you get really excited and identified with a personality type, and maybe you like it, maybe you like that you're really strong or really helpful or really successful, and that's part of your personality and it's gone well for you, then you feel like, oh yeah, I can just type people, like, because this is a good thing. But actually not everyone has that relationship with their motivation. And so then if you go around and you sort of put people in these boxes, it does the opposite of providing the freedom that the tool could provide. So if the tool can provide this freedom because it helps you decide whether or not you want to act out of certain motivation or you want to choose another path, that's awesome because you have claimed that as your own. You've claimed that as like, this is my body, this is my motivation, this is my, like, I get to decide how I want to react to stress or how I want to react to this feeling of insignificance or whatever is named in the personality. But then if someone comes up to you and says, hey, this is who you are, and it says like all these really deep things about you and things you haven't had the space to wrestle through, and then you don't have an ownership over it, then it's a trap. It's not a tool for freedom. It's the opposite. And this is the way that really good tools and technologies work, right? There's always misuses of good technology. But the sad thing is that it can be such a resource, but if we use it poorly, it's actually the opposite, and it degenerates into like something pretty problematic. So we have to be really gentle. And I think that when we begin to do the work ourselves, we realize how hard it is, like how there's just this little tender person inside of us that really, that has created all these protections that end up looking like a certain kind of personality. And when we peek behind those protections, we realize how hard it is to emerge from those. And when we do that, it becomes harder to really want to slam a personality type on top of someone because we recognize that we have to be so gentle with ourselves. And there's a lot we're all dealing with. We're all dealing with different things, and not just 9 different things. We have these categories maybe that we fit in that help us deal with things, but then we all have our own stories that are vastly different. And so it's not really good relational practice to put these boxes on people because it actually can stop relationship instead of invite relationship.
So what, let's say someone is just figuring out what type they are. What's a practical way that they could use their knowledge and just a knowledge of what the Enneagram is in general? Like, how would you apply it to life as a tool?
Yeah, totally. So the Enneagram, I always like to say, is not predictive. And so often that's the kind of thing that people want to do immediately with the Enneagram. They like find some part of themselves that they're like, nope, don't like it. This is causing me suffering. This is painful. I'm going to just cut this off, right? And I would say the practical advice that I have is don't fall into the trap that the Enneagram predicts your behavior and therefore you just change your behavior and then you've dealt with the problem. Practical advice is to sit with yourself in it, to be really compassionate with the parts of yourself that have grown up in the way that they have, and to really, I call it the 5 A's of, well, not just my school, the narrative tradition calls it the 5 A's of transformation. Awareness, so when you become aware of type or of something in yourself that's really burdening you or tough, become aware of it. accept it, move to acceptance, like this is a part of who I am, and then appreciate it. There's a reason that I am this way. My body has been trying to protect me. Like little, we'll talk about Caroline later, but little Caroline got strong. And maybe she got other things too. We don't know what type you are, but she's identified as an 8 for a long time. So there was a reason little Caroline became aware of power, right? And looked around and who was controlling who. And that was good. That was to protect little Caroline. And to be fair, like I just did a Enneagram session with a couple who had immense childhood trauma, like nightmarish childhood trauma, right? And I do not think that the Enneagram solves the problem of their childhood trauma. It talks about how they did respond in those situations, and I think that gave us an opportunity to really hold them in that space and to say, like, so why did you get hypervigilant, right? Why did you start dreaming about the future? Because the present was so fucking hard, right? And so we have to, those are the first 3 A's of transformation. We have to become aware, accept, and appreciate that these structures have done something good for us. And it's only in that place that we have enough space and compassion to be able to decide to do something different. If we think of these personalities as kind of like we get on these little pathways in our brain and we're sort of stuck on them because we've always done things this way, those first 3 things allow us to see, oh, I actually have a choice here. And I've made this choice for a long time, and this is why. And I appreciate that there were good reasons, but now I don't feel like I need to stay on this pathway anymore. Maybe I can try something else. And sometimes that's hard because we don't even know what else to try, which is the value of doing this, I think, in community as well, because other people have different pathways. They have different ways of doing things. So I would say, practically speaking, if you find yourself in hyper judgment mode when you are working with the Enneagram, that's not a good place to start in terms of practically using the Enneagram. It will always just reinforce the pattern. So if your fear is about being harmed or controlled, and then you notice that you have these parts of yourself that are harming you and controlling you, then sometimes within the personality, the option is to become strong and control the things that are controlling you, right? But actually, that just keeps the pattern in motion. Instead of taking you to a vulnerable place where you're like, oh wow, these patterns have controlled me for a long time, and these patterns are about controlling things. And that helped me because I had a very chaotic or out of control, dangerous, or at least dangerous feeling childhood or whatever. And so from that place of acceptance, then you can begin to ask, now what do I do with this after accepting that there are reasons that this is here? So yeah, I would say it's an interesting question to answer because it's so different from person to person, but that's important to keep in mind, and it cannot be done from a place of judging. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't be grieved or you can't have whatever feelings you have about, a lot of times people go through grief when they realize, like, oh wow, this has been controlling my life for a long time. I didn't realize I was motivated by this. They sort of go back through their history and they're like, wow, that decision. And just like seeing the pattern can feel overwhelming, and feel whatever you feel. But the first step is, however this is, if this is through friendship with someone, through a therapeutic setting, through time spent in reflection or meditation, just allowing yourself to continue to stay present with an accepting voice. And that's why, I mean, therapists, we pay them to be those helpful, accepting voices. But also some of us know, like, oh yeah, this is a good friend to do this with because they're more of have a therapeutic mindset. And if you have an ability to be, or we all have an ability to be self-accepting, but if you have found a space where you can accept yourself well, that's a great place to go with your Enneagram knowledge. And then we all have to go in a lot of different directions based on what we find when we look inward. So,
is there any way to use the Enneagram in relationship with other people. So for example, you know, if we've just said, don't do the thing where you're like, oh my gosh, you're such a 2, blah, 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 blah. Here, I'll get you this because otherwise.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You know, coasters.
Yeah.
So if we're saying don't be that kind of person that's like, you're such a 2, and like just kind of quickly labels and then runs with something that doesn't necessarily create connection or empathy or understanding with someone, what is a way to use the, maybe it's even just in your own mind, like you're not verbalizing it of like, oh my gosh, tap on the head, like you're such a 4, but actually just using it in your own mind or heart in the way that you interact with someone. What is a healthy way to use it in relationship?
Yeah. Well, so there's so many different levels of ways that you can use it. And one of my teachers, I have a tendency towards like, let's get to the deepest level of how it can be used. But one of my teachers, noticing that in me, once said, you know what, Annie, if the only thing people learn when they work with the Enneagram is that people are really different and they don't think, feel, and act the same way, and for really good reasons they don't, like that's a great starting place, right? And that would be more of an internal work that people would do. They would encounter the Enneagram and think, oh, wow, I thought this is how everyone would process. I thought everyone needed this kind of affection. I thought everyone needed this kind of control. I thought everyone needed this kind of perfectionism. And so that's not true. And so that it can be really helpful in that way. But then when it comes to really interacting with people about it, same goes with others as it goes for ourselves. It's about compassion. And compassion literally means to suffer with. And when we begin to have compassion with ourselves, to sit with ourselves, to see these areas where we become defenders, and then we get inside to suffer with ourselves about why we needed to defend, then we realize the importance of that work. And we're able to, if we can hold that space with ourselves, we can hold that space for others. So I would say when you go to engage with other people about the Enneagram, rule of thumb is that we don't type people. We just don't. And I've had a lot of people I've worked with who are like, I'm breaking your rule. I type people all the time. And they're like being funny about it. And I'm like, okay, but like actually it's a problem. Like, and I'm not a big person who's like, here are the rules. Like I'm not a big rule person, but this is like actually a problem. And part of the problem is that we think that if someone's like seems cool with it or whatever, that it's fine, or if they don't know anything about it, it's fine. But actually people go away from that time and they have to process and do something with that. That is different than inviting people into your experience of, I've encountered this tool, this is how it's helped me, I even think like I've read through it and I've noticed that we have really different patterns and I'm wondering how you identify, would you be willing to engage this? And if they say no, you don't have consent. If they say no, you don't have consent. And that's really important, because if the Enneagram is about freedom, which I think it is, then to put someone in a type when they don't want to be typed means that they're not going to probably also engage with it in a way that allows for freedom. Maybe they'll go read about it and they'll attach themselves to the worst parts of it and think, oh, she thinks I'm controlling, she thinks I'm a perfectionist, whatever the type is about. And that's just, it's not what it's for. And so I would say, with regard to how we communicate about it together, if it's not a relationship of trust, don't. Because it's a lot of information about yourself. It's like, it gets really deep. And so you're not just talking about like, oh, this is not the Myers-Briggs. It's not like I'm an introvert, I'm an extrovert. It's like, no, this is why I go hide in my room maybe for like hours and days on end, because I don't feel like I have enough energy to meet the demands of the world, which is kind of telling you a lot about a person, right?
Yep.
Or this is why I never go home and I'm alone, because my sort of extroversion, my fear of pain keeps me from going and being alone, right? And so that's a lot to like know about a person and to share with a person and to steward when you have the information. So if you're not interested in being present to someone in the continuing work that the Enneagram brings up, don't bring it up. Because just talking about it like it's a parlor game and being kind of like cute about it, like that's not, and you want to do that and then leave, that's not good work with the Enneagram. Not freedom. That's not freedom.
Guys, I want to type that out. I want to type that out. So that was like the best quote ever, by the way. It's not a parlor game. That's amazing. And it's like the way that you're talking about it makes me think about one of my other friends who says that it's never our place to tell someone or even to think about what their sexuality is. Like, other people get to tell us. We don't go, she's totally gay, he's totally gay, he's so straight. Yeah. Like, you tell us. Yeah. We are here to like listen to your process and to be there for each other, because it is so personal and it is so intimate, and it's not our space to just go around slapping labels on people, because like you said, then we walk away and we might forget about it and we might be like, oh, we totally like told that, friend of ours, like, do you think you're probably gay? And then they have to deal with the fallout of that. Yeah. They have to deal with the ramifications of what we just sort of slapped on them and then walked away. And so I think it's a really good thing to think about when it comes to anything, and especially because the Enneagram is such a deeply intimate look at ourselves. Just being at a bar and having someone, say they don't know what it is and being like, well, you're probably like a 2 or a 4, and then going into it and then being like, oh, you're totally a 4, and then just walking away is not a parlor game.
Yeah. And there's lots of ways we can excuse ourselves to make it that way. And so I would just notice, how are you excusing yourself? Like, that's interesting data about yourself. Like, why do I think I can do this? And why do I think I can do this in this relationship? But then there are some types of people who will invite it more because they maybe don't trust themselves to come up with, like, who am I? And so sometimes we end up playing into someone else's deepest insecurities by telling them and giving them a label because they're so afraid that I don't know who I am, I can't figure out who I am. So figure out another way to support them other than telling them who they are. Be a present supporter, a listener, a question asker. That will serve in a way that just saying like, yeah, this is who you are, will not. It might help in the moment if they're feeling like anxiety or fear that they don't know who they are, but it doesn't help ultimately because it didn't help them develop that muscle of like tuning in to like, what's going on inside of me, instead of having someone else name that for them. So I think the last word that I would use in terms of how to hold the Enneagram is hospitality. Like, Parker Palmer, who I love, talks about how the stranger brings strange truth. And so even our friends, even our closest people, are in many ways strangers. We're strangers to their experiences. I don't know what it's like to be in Caroline's world. And so through question asking, this sort of strange truth emerges, things that I don't understand through experience. It allows us to be curious. And the place that we forget that is usually in our dearest relationships, right? So I don't think of my mom as a stranger. I don't think of my best friends as strangers, but actually like to hold them in that way allows for other parts of them to emerge, because we get so caught in one way of being, and we teach ourselves that that's how we are, and we teach our communities that that's how we are, and at a certain point it sort of gets solidified in a way that it's hard for other parts of us to emerge. So we just never know what might emerge. We never know like a new part of someone that we might meet. We never know, like that's part of doing the work with ourselves too, is like, I like the map and like the inner landscape language. So if we're using the Enneagram as a map to our inner landscape, that doesn't mean that we have to go around in the territory. The map doesn't tell us everything that's in there. It helps us see like, oh, I've never taken this turn before, I'm going to try that. I'm going to get into the wilderness, and it's in the wilderness and it's getting off those paths that we meet strange parts of ourselves, and that we meet strange parts of our community and friendships, and people are allowed to expand and grow in ways that maybe weren't predictable. So we're not using this to predict. We're using this to invite.
Yes, we are. There was a question. How do we learn to trust those who guide us through Enneagram?
Yeah.
Good question.
Oh, what a great question. Well, so when I do typing interviews, which we're about to do, I never tell people, never is the wrong word. I generally work to not tell people that based on what I've heard, this is what you are. Sometimes I have a hard time hearing anything but one type, and I say, this is what I heard. I heard this one type, but you could be something else. To me, it's really important that whoever teaches you the Enneagram is not interested in making sure they nail your type and predict anything about you. Actually, I don't think you should trust that. Like, that's not actually trustworthy, because to hold the Enneagram is really to teach someone how to use a map. And in that case, there's a real, good teachers meet someone where they're at. And so if it doesn't feel like someone is trustworthy in terms of meeting you where you are and listening to you and what your needs are and what your questions are, but they're more interested in making sure you fit inside of a category, that's not trustworthy. But if it is about learning to trust that someone cares for you, or that someone, learning to trust that someone accepts you as you are, sometimes where we don't trust people is also where it's a way to look inward and see, oh, do I not trust that I'm acceptable? Do I not trust that I'm lovable? Do I not trust that I have worth? So if you find that your trust comes from this sense of just not believing that you have those good things, or that ultimate truth of your lovability and your worth and your security, then that's work for you to do. But if you find that you're not trusting someone because it doesn't seem like they're listening, or they're more concerned with making sure that you figure out type right now, or any of that stuff, then I don't know that you need to learn to trust that. There are untrustworthy things in the world, and I think learning to trust is also about learning what's trustworthy. And so if something's not trustworthy, you'll have to suss that out. But if something sounds like, oh, I think that's trustworthy, but I just can't accept it because I can't accept my own worth, or I can't accept someone asking me a question I don't like to be asked but really probably need to answer, or something like that, those kinds of things, then it's learning maybe about how to trust yourself as well. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a bunch of good questions. How long do you have to go through the question asking phase? I think there's a couple of question asking phases. There's in a typing interview, there's how long is a typing interview usually?
Well, depends on who's doing it. It can be an hour to 2 hours.
Okay. Yeah. So, and in that space, that's a shorter question asking phase, and that's more about and for me. And then question asking in relationship, I think that should always be there. I've been with Jaden for 15 years, and our relationship is always better when I come from discovery, when I come from seeking him out and listening to what his answers are about a specific thing, rather than just assuming I know, or putting him in a box well, you're always this way, so this is how you're going to be right now. Relationships are always better when you come from curiosity, and when you come from being open to the fact that we're evolving, growing, changing humans, and maybe we don't always want to be seen as the very same exact consistent thing. So I think question asking in relationship should always be there. Hey, Erin. Okay, so how would you suggest to begin exploring this for someone who knows nothing about it? Books, online, an expert?
Yeah. So there's lots of different ways. I am trained as a teacher in the narrative tradition, And in our tradition, we prefer typing interviews. So whereas tests can really try to get at dynamics, and sometimes you can be a certain way and sometimes you can be another way, and they try to suss out, when are you like that, when are you not? They're still only about 65% accurate. And so the value for me in the typing interview is that I can ask one of those questions that would be on a test and then have a follow-up question. Like, has it always been that way? Or what was a significant moment that you felt that shift? Or is it like this in this situation but not in that one? And that really helps suss out the dynamics. So I would say typing interviews, which I do, are a really fun way, and a way to be companioned in the process. But ultimately, it's up to you to self-identify. So an expert shouldn't be identifying for you. And in that case, some people just prefer to read through all of the types and to kind of listen to what comes up in the process. I think that's interesting to do anyway, because sometimes you read about a type and you're like, what? Mm-hmm. Like, there are people that go through the world like that? So this is one of those ways that, too, you might have a feeling come up like, oh my gosh, I really don't like that way of being. And then you're like, oh, I think my mom might be that way. Mm-hmm. No, that's different than, Mom, you're that way. It's it's dealing with oh wow, it brings up that there are these vastly different ways, and that some of them, they're there maybe for good reasons, but they're harder to deal with for whatever reason in ourselves. So, so to answer the question, I would say if you have no idea, you can take a test. There's free ones. There's $10 ones. The biggest one is the READY, the Riso Hudson Enneagram Type Indicator, and that's at Enneagram Institute. There's also a $10 one at Enneagram Worldwide, and Enneagram Worldwide is the narrative tradition that I was trained in, so I really like that one. But when you get those test results, if you do the test, my suggestion is to take the top 4. So, that's almost half, but take the top 4 and do some extensive reading about those. So test possible, but don't trust the top result. Reading, also a possibility and a good one, especially if you want to understand kind of the difference between the types. And then, of course, I do this all the time and love the typing interview process and the process of companioning people through discovering type. So those would be the ways.
Yeah. For me, since you all asked me and I'm really the expert here, just kidding, I'm not. That was a joke. Yeah. I will say that my intro to the Enneagram was being told what my type was, which, we all know now not to do that, right? Who's with me? But it's okay. I love this person. It's fine. I'm not mad. But that was my intro, was there's this thing called the Enneagram and this is what you are. And I was like, oh. It was I didn't have any point of reference. So I just was like, okay. And then it was actually not for 2 years until I even started to research it and figure out that I actually cared about it. Because up until that point, it just meant a number.
Yeah.
And then I read a book about it. The first book I read, I think, was the Richard Rohr book, which is a great intro to it. It's definitely more of a spiritual
I think it's called The Enneagram, a Christian Perspective.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
If that's
clear. But then another one that I really love is the Beatrice Chestnut book.
The Complete Enneagram.
Yeah.
So we've only been talking about 9 types, but truly, my friends, there's 27 types.
Mm-hmm. Not to freak anyone out, but it's true.
It's awesome.
So I really love the Beatrice Chestnut book because it goes into the subtypes of how each type shows up in the world. And so that, I think, is actually my favorite Enneagram book. And it takes commitment. It's a book this thick. And so it's not just something that you just get through. And that's, I think, why it bums me out when people are I took an online test and I'm either a 4 or an 8. And I'm like, okay. And then they're like, yeah, so that's all I know. And I'm like, oh, there's so much more to it than that. That doesn't really mean or do anything.
And it's the sorting process. the fact that someone would identify with those two, it's that sorting process that is the juicy part.
Yeah.
Which is why I love the interview, because it's the start of, like, here's how we can really sort through it, and resourcing someone to, like, begin to notice different parts of themselves and to dig deeper in certain areas. Yeah.
So the other thing that I will say in the plug for actually doing lots of work and reading the book is that in that process, then I learned about other people. So then it wasn't just about me and me figuring out myself. Then it was like, oh, that's why maybe that person is like that in the world. And it really helped me with empathy for other people instead of judging them and being like, they're like that and I don't like that about them. It was more, oh, they're like that because of some pain. And that's like how they're coping with it. And not that I'm an advocate for this, but I started, this was years ago, maybe I wouldn't do this now, but I literally started a chart in the back of the book that was like each number, and I was like, I think this person is this, and as I would read each number, I'd be like, oh my gosh, that is totally so-and-so, and then I like go in the back of the book, and I had like my little chart of who I thought everyone was, and it was really, for me, it was just about kind of identifying patterns and being like, oh, that kind of way of being in the world is really consistent with these people that I know and how they do things. And one other thing that I really, really love before I let you talk again is that with the Enneagram, there's kind of like I don't want to say a hierarchy, but it's kind of like levels of health. So that instead of it just being like, this is who I am, and I feel like with Myers-Briggs, it's kind of like, this is what you are, the end. But with the Enneagram, it's kind of like, here's what you are, here's the road to health, here's the road to more integration of using this in your life. So I really love those things about it. Let's see what juicy questions we have. So, okay, I grew up evangelical, and so I have some real trust issues. Do you have recommendations for people who are skilled at meeting that issue?
Me. I'm just kidding, but I also grew up evangelical. And so I have similar trust issues with evangelicalism. And I think if we're going to talk about trustworthiness, there's real reasons for those.
Yeah.
A resource for you would be, I just did a video series with the liturgists, and they have a relationship, obviously, with Christianity and people who are struggling with their experience with it. And so we did Enneagram work for people who have deconstructed or their faith has sort of like imploded for various reasons. So if you can go to their website, I think it's shop.theliturgist.com, and there's a whole like video series about that. And then I would say find a coach or a therapist or a spiritual director who is sensitive to those issues and will allow you to sort through them, trying to figure out where the value is in those experiences, what was good, not throw everything out so your whole world disappears, but then to hold on, cling to the good, and to move into new territory.
What's your website?
Enneagramforwholeness.com, and my Instagram is Enneagram for Wholeness.
Cool. Get it, Annie. She knows her shit. As someone who's very uneducated in this subject, I find this very interesting. Awesome.
Great.
Can you speak about how childhood trauma relates to the Enneagram? Can your type change as you grow and heal?
Yeah. Okay, so was just doing, as I mentioned earlier, just doing work with some people who have some pretty radical trauma from childhood. And this was a question that came up. And so the theory, Enneagram theory, is that your type doesn't change. But if type represents some basic fears in the world and coping mechanisms, I had a pretty trauma-free childhood, right? But I still identify with this type that has fears of abandonment. Now, if you can imagine that someone else who's my type, who has actually been abandoned, what trauma does is it changes what the work is. So for me, I don't have to do the same kind of intensive trauma work around abandonment. Sometimes it's more like cognitive behavioral work around like, why do I feel like I've been abandoned? In some ways, why do I have this fantasy that I've been abandoned? And not that I don't have any stories of that or whatever, but not in a hugely traumatic way. And so what trauma does is it just intensifies the reality of the fear. So like all of these types represent coping with real issues. So like, and that doesn't, so not to say that my experience of myself and my story there aren't like precious and difficult things in that, but for my friends who have had such severe trauma, it changes the work in some significant ways. And one of them is that you have to spend, I think, longer time in the acceptance and appreciation of why you coped in the way that you did. Because this isn't something that didn't happen. It's something that really happened. And sometimes in hugely grotesque ways. And in really tough ways, people have been traumatized. And so the Enneagram is not the solution to the problem in the sense that like once you name that this is how you coped, that doesn't help you with dealing with the reality that something bad really did happen. And so there are professionals that really need to be engaged in that way. People who work with, especially now that we're doing all this work with the body. I think the Enneagram helps us legitimize the fears and legitimize why we coped in the way that we did, and help us learn when we have opportunities to move through and past and out of certain ways, and when we need to just spend a little more time there with why we did cope in that way. And so I think, I don't think type changes. I think different situations bring up new ways to encounter the basic fears that we have. I do think we change, and I think we grow, and I think we, if the Enneagram is about, we have these sort of fixations that make it seem like our reality is a certain way all the time. Part of working with the Enneagram is like, with trauma, you're stuck in a loop of a story, and you keep experiencing it the same way. And so engaging with the Enneagram on different levels of trauma or experiences that felt traumatic helps us to see the story, see how to work with the story, and then see invitations into telling the story in a new way. And sometimes that takes incredible time and effort and energy because sometimes the trauma is lodged in our body in really, really real ways. This is another reason to not use the Enneagram so flippantly. Mm-hmm. Because people's coping mechanisms are not just like silly little things that they do that create this personality. It's why it doesn't really fit in terms of like other personality tools. Like it's not a strengths finder, right? It's not just like 5 cool things about you. It's like they're like when you're ritually raped in a cult in your childhood, you're gonna learn some pretty intense coping mechanisms, and it's a damn good thing. Mm-hmm. And we have to be so gentle with those. And so in answer to the question, I think that trauma helps or makes it harder for us later in life to know where real threats are. Because we have such real experience of threat. Mm-hmm. And we know the reality that there are threats. So we can't just like wave it away. You know? And not that we can't, not that other people can either, but I think people who have had severe trauma know what I'm talking about. You know what it's like if you've experienced real trauma to be talking to someone who hasn't really experienced a lot of that, and they're just kind of like talking about something like more in a head way, and you're like, no, my body's actually like feeling this right now. I'm having this response. So careful.
And one thing that comes up for me in like, can people change type? I would also say no, but I think that there is such a thing as being socialized to show up a certain way.
Oh yeah.
Like I think, especially since we're talking about, sort of evangelical upbringings, I think a lot of women especially are socialized to look like 2s a lot of times, because that is the type of behavior that is praised, that is celebrated, that is looked at as desirable for a partner, for people, for a wife. Like, if you want to, you know, if you want someone to want to marry you, you need to look like this. And so I think that there's a difference between changing type and knowing yourself better to really, really get to who you actually are and get rid of any surface level behavioral patterns that are just there, again, as a coping mechanism to get to be accepted and to fit into your culture. And if your culture says, if you're good, you will look like this, and then you start to act like that, that doesn't necessarily mean you're actually a 2. It might just mean that you have been socialized to look like and act like a 2, but actually the more you get to know yourself and really get in there, then all of a sudden you're like, oh, actually I'm not a 2 and I've never been a 2. I was being a 2 to cope.
And coping is all about what kind of environment you're in. And so changing environments bring out different kinds of reactions. Like you could act more like, so like me growing up in a community where 2-ness would have been like the ideal for women.
Which is also a city in Tunisia. Tunis.
Okay.
Sorry.
Tunisia reveals. Did you have that?
Yes, of course.
For me, I wasn't super identified with that. This is a part of type, but I was happy being different. Yes. And so for me, it gave me a really great context to practice my difference. And some people hated it so much that they rebelled and were like really angry about it and moved against it. And then when they got to a place where there wasn't that kind of expectation, they didn't look like rebels anymore because they didn't need to be, based on to protect different parts of themselves. So really, like, changing context, and then also like growing up and meeting new parts of ourselves, people will look like different types at different times. And on the Enneagram, if you're at one of these points, these lines between them are really important as well. All the types are connected. Actually, in the very structure, there's lines that connect them to 4 different types. And so you can often take on what looks like other types. What we keep, though, is sort of those basic connections to certain fears of who we are. And I would say that those fears are connected to certain gifts we came into the world with, and certain kinds of connection with ultimate reality that we all reflect in different ways. And so when we begin to be afraid that we're not reflecting them and those things don't actually exist, then we create a personality to protect them and to say, yes, they do exist. I exist. And I exist in this way. And I know that goodness is possible, or peace is possible, or love is possible. And we're trying to protect those things through our personality. And so every new situation challenges those things in new ways. And so we express in different ways. Different situations feel more secure, different situations feel more stressful. Sometimes we're a part of creating that security or stress, and sometimes we don't have control over that at all. And so all of those dynamics just totally change the expression of type.
Juicy stuff. Let's see if we can get to a couple other questions before we do some fun other stuff. Do the type interviews help sort through the 27 types or just the 9?
Yeah, so generally I do 2 different interviews to try and sort through them both because it would take a lot of time. But yeah, and sometimes it comes up in a typing interview, it just becomes really clear. And sometimes I'll just do education about that at the end. Yeah.
Getting subtype knowledge for me was a really big sort of piece of understanding how the Enneagram can really support me, because yes, someone told me like, you're an 8, and I was like, okay, but no one told me what my subtype was. Yeah. And getting to discover that was a really rad piece of my education. Let's see, what is integration? Is there a short definition of integration?
Well, let me just say Yeah, I mean, there is. There's two ways I want to talk about it. The first is that in the Enneagram, with those lines I explained, there's two lines that represent movement in stress and security. And sometimes those lines are called the path of integration and the path of disintegration. I don't prefer that language because actually both paths are important. So if you can see disintegration as a good thing because it dissolves your sort of fantasies about who you are, and integration as not necessarily the better thing, but just the path where you're able to come to more of a reality about yourself, to pull pieces of your story together, who you are, your relationships, and do that in a way where you feel like secure in who you are, worth, love, all of those things. I would say in a short answer, that's it gets used in Enneagram world to talk about the path of integration, but in terms of like larger world, it's about being whole. And so wholeness includes lots of things. Sometimes wholeness includes things we don't want it to include, features of our internal or external reality that suck, and that we'd rather just like cut out. But integration is acceptance, and the ability to work with those things.
That's juicy. Do you feel like some people use Enneagram as an excuse for their behavior?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Also fascinating. Wow, my finger's huge right here. Also fascinating is when people, I've experienced people use, like, when they have certain behavior, they're like, well, this is just me in health. This is me, like, in integration. This is what it looks like when I'm in health and, like, really integrating into this other type. And I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this is actually why I don't love the language of integration and disintegration, because no one's like positively like, well, I'm just disintegrating right now. They might say that as like a plea for help, but what I hear in integration and disintegration language, or what I hear in like health and unhealth language, is this like judgment about the moment that you're in. And like, I think the judging part of our brain is important for certain things, but it doesn't help when you're in a moment of like deep stress or difficulty or despair to be like, I'm in unhealth. Like sometimes you're not. Like sometimes we need to grieve things because we're really feeling a sense of loss. And so the question is about if people use this as an excuse, and the answer is yes, but we're using everything as an excuse. So most of our lives are oriented around protecting ourselves and defending our ways of seeing and behaving because of these deep fears that we have. So this is the problem, is that the Enneagram ends up just helping us do that better because we have more specific language. And I was just working with someone the other day who loves the Enneagram, but when it comes to really working with the fear of her type, she will admit, like, I don't really want to do this. And I'm like, but you love the Enneagram. And she's like, yeah, like she just likes to stay in, like to think through it. It's interesting. It's fascinating. And I'm talking about this woman from the other day, but it's representative of pretty much the way a lot of us want to do it. Like, we want these tools to help us understand reality, and then because we're Westerners, we want to stay in our head, and once we understand everything, then we can control it, and once we have control, we're still defended, right? Instead of letting it be something we embody and take into our lives. And I'll say, like, when people start to use the Enneagram in that way, they become less obsessed with the Enneagram, which is a weird thing, but they're not trying to use it to predict all the time or to buffer or to like explain. They're really getting into the territory, and they're working with those places that are bringing up pain, that are bringing up anger, that are bringing up anxiety. So yeah, that is actually one of the hardest parts of my work right now, is that that's how people often want to talk about the Enneagram, and I just don't have, I'm learning to have the space, but for people who've known about it for a long time, who still just want to like shoot the shit about the Enneagram, I'm like, guys, like this is for something else. In the beginning, it's cool, right? Because you're like learning the language, and it's a way of, it's a tool that has a lot of rich language. So as in the beginning, as you learn about it, you know what, that's great. You have a community that's getting to know it. You're using the language all the time so you can understand the dynamics of the types and the centers of intelligence and the instincts. But at a certain point, like, you got the language. Now go on in there and do the work. Because when we do the work, it's not an excuse anymore, because we've learned that, like, actually this is causing suffering for me and my relationships, and there's more, and I'm interested in what more there is. The Enneagram doesn't tell me what more there is. It doesn't tell me what reality is. It tells me the ways that I block myself from experiencing the fullness of reality in my own life and in the life of my friendships and community. And so that's why the hospitality piece is important. Like, we just don't know, like, what strange things we're going to find in ourselves and other people. And so if you're using it to just explain away everything, then that sounds like a lot of kind of control of how you're seeing yourself, and not a lot of openness to what else might emerge, or what could, upon request. Like, if somebody comes to you, and sometimes this is a misuse of the Enneagram, right? So if somebody comes to you and is like, you're being such a 3 right now. Okay, I don't appreciate that use of the Enneagram. However, what you can hear them saying is like, your behavior is really distressing to me in some way. Now, I consider a person who wants to say something like that, consider what is actually distressing to me about this person's behavior. Can I make a request? Like, it's really hurting me that we're trying to move ahead with this project, or that we're abandoning this project altogether because you have a new idea or something. That's a different kind of statement, right? And then this person is invited into a question about themselves and why, and they might find it easy to move on to the next project or something. And so if they decide, like, well, yeah, I'm just a 3, this is what I do, what you're denying is that request from another person to look at this point of pain in a relationship. So that's the Enneagram as a defense again. Now, that all could be worked out in a different way, right? Like, if I'm aware that there's a certain kind of suffering that someone goes through, then I can have empathy while also having my own needs, right? Like, I can say, this is really hard for me. I understand why does it seem like you really want to move on to this next thing? And then the Enneagram could help sort of you with a direction to look, and then you come back to responding, to being right here, to being present to the request and why it's so hard to do anything different than you've always done. But using the Enneagram to explain away behavior is not necessarily going to help with relationships.
Nope. It's not. Love the liturgist. Even with my atheist soul, I'm still open. Thanks for the affirmation. Oh, awesome. This is also good. I have to go, but thank you so much for doing this. But in my church, my coping mechanisms were just taken as being rebellious. How on earth do you isolate the real threats? Yep. Preach, Caroline. Can we also talk about how many women cope to a patriarchal adherence breeds this belief for many women that if they comply with the patriarchy, they'll be protected unless you're a woman of color?
Yeah. Yes.
Yep. Yes, all of this. Yep. And hello, greetings. What's the topic? The Enneagram. We're talking about the Enneagram. I'll go ahead and type it right here. So we're talking about the Enneagram with Enneagram for Wholeness. There we go. So now anyone who's joining. Oh wow, we're maxed out in an hour and we have 90 seconds left. So apparently we can only go for an hour. So
have we been talking for an hour?
We have. So what we'll
fun.
do is we will go do my typing interview, and then we'll come back and do another live and talk about what I learned and what it was like. So if anyone is watching the replay of this, we've been with Annie, who is at Enneagram for Wholeness, who is a coach. She's certified. She's not just someone who read a book once and thinks that she is awesome, but she is awesome. And you can go hire her. You can follow her. You can hire her to do a typing interview. I'm about to do a typing interview with her right now, and I will report back about what I learn. Right now, I think I'm an 8, but we'll go find out.
Also, I do workshops and retreats, which is where we've done that. Caroline and I have at Light Lab, and I really think that's a cool way to learn too. It's in community, and it's also in a narrative tradition, so there's a lot of group interviewing and conversation and storytelling, which is really fun.
Yeah, so stick around. We'll be back in a while, and I will post more about what I learned in my very first typing interview. Happy Saturday, guys.
Bye.